Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and the warmest of welcomes to Sea Fever. Sea Fever is North Norfolk's festival of poetry and prose. This is the fourth such festival we've staged, and it's the very first one that we're doing virtually. Virtual has been such a success for us that when we do Sea Fever 5 next May, I'm sure, as well as inviting large numbers of people to this wonderful venue, Wells Maltings, we'll also be doing it online. So welcome to this online performance. Here, on this particular evening, it's my huge pleasure and privilege to introduce two great people, Jonty Driver and John Cook. Jonty is a poet, these days a full-time poet by profession, and also with a background as a leading educationalist in this country. He also gave me a wonderful line, which I suppose I would expect from a poet, and he said he described himself as, or perhaps he'd been described, as a public school headmaster with a background as a revolutionary. Well, I used to be an advertising man, and I wish I'd written that line. It's a wonderful line. But more seriously, Jonty played a most active part, as you will hear in the conversation that we're going to listen to in a couple of minutes, in the days of apartheid in South Africa, one of the most terrible, eventually, ultimately crimes against humanity in the 20th century, of which, of course, there have been more than one. Jonty was imprisoned for his trouble, as you will hear, and eventually ended up in the United Kingdom, where, as I say, he's had a most distinguished career. One of his pupils at Sevenoaks was the other person I'm introducing, John Cook. John Cook is now Emeritus Professor of Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia, and himself a most distinguished student, academic and writer on the Romantic poets, particularly Hazlitt. Romantic writers, particularly Hazlitt. I was fascinated by their conversation, and the story of apartheid is something that sadly, with Mr. Trump's refusal recently to condemn the white supremacists in the United States, has painfully contemporary resonance. I was fascinated by the talk between John and Jonty. I think you will be too, and also at times deeply moved. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, John and Jonty.
Welcome to this reading and discussion with the South African-born poet, biographer and novelist, Jonty Driver. I should say at the outset that it's not a matter of either accident or administration that it's he and I who are talking together. I first met Jonty many years ago, in 1964, in fact, in a schoolroom in Sevenoaks School in Kent, where I was a pupil. And Jonty, newly arrived from South Africa, came into the classroom and held the attention of a group of quite unruly adolescent boys effortlessly. There was some rumor about him before I met him for the first time, that he'd been expelled from South Africa, that he'd been an anti-apartheid activist, and that's something that we'll be talking more about in a minute. But it's worth just saying that Jonty went on to a career as a very distinguished teacher and educationalist. After teaching at Sevenoaks School, he taught at Cleethorpes Comprehensive, and then he was the principal of the Island School in Hong Kong before returning to take up headmasterships, first at Berkhamsted and then at Wellington School, where he worked until his retirement in 2000, at which time he became a full-time writer. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Jonty has written in a number of forms. He's published novels, biography and memoir. But this evening, or rather in this session, in this interview, what we'll be concentrating on is the work that he's done as a poet, his most sustained work in some senses, I think, and perhaps the work that has most sustained him. He has published in numerous journals and magazines in this country, in the United States and in South Africa. They include the Times Literary Supplement, the New Review, the London Review, the Yale Review. And he has also published collections and pamphlets, a selection of his poems so far, that was published in 2006, and numerous and sometimes very beautifully produced pamphlets, including Citizen of Elsewhere, and most recently, The Journey Back, which was published this year. Jonty, I'd like to begin by talking to you about what obviously was a key transition point in your life, and that was what happened in 1964, 63, 64, when you were arrested for your anti-apartheid activities. And in a moment, we're going to hear you read a poem that you wrote out of that experience, a poem called In Solitary Confinement, Sea Point Police Cells. But I wonder if you could just say a bit more before you read the poem about the circumstances of your arrest and what the experience of solitary confinement was like.
In 1963 and 64, I was the elected president of the National Union of South African Students. Very, very anti-apartheid, very much in the public eye, being attacked, especially by the Minister of Justice, Mr. Forster. Some of my friends and acquaintances set up an organization called the African Resistance Movement, which was trying to bring about change in South Africa by violent means. It happened round about the same time that the ANC set up its armed wing. It was mainly liberals, a few Trotskyites, and they were actually very successful until things went terribly wrong. I was never a member, knew about it, but was never a member. The police thought I must be, so they arrested me and held me in solitary confinement for 4 or 5 weeks altogether. And then they let me out, and I came to England, and my passport expired, and the South Africans wouldn't return it, and then wouldn't give me a visa to go back. So I became, in effect, a prohibited immigrant in my home country.
Right. And when you were in solitary confinement, I mean, did you know how long you'd be in for?
No, that's the whole point of it. You have no idea how long. And in fact, the poem that I shall read in a moment was written when the police were debating with the prosecutors whether they could make a charge stick against me, because they knew I hadn't been a member of the African Resistance Movement. There was talk about getting me out of the Suppression of Communism Act, which would have been very, very funny, because I had been a convinced anti-communist from the age of 17 onwards. And in the end, they decided there was nothing that would stick. So they let me leave, but made sure I didn't go back again.
Right. And did you write the poem that you're about to read while you were in solitary confinement?
No. Often the poems come well after the actual experience.
Right.
The poem in solitary confinement, in the police cells, it was the third police cell I had been in, my third week. They tended to move you quite quickly from each week, in fact, from place to place, in case you built up relationships, particularly, oddly enough, with policemen, because most policemen were human beings. There were a few bastards, but mostly they were perfectly nice people who, after a while, began to be quite friendly towards one. So they moved you. In this particular cell, by standing on the lavatory, and in those days I was stronger than I am now, I could grab the bars of the cell window and pull myself up and look across the bay to Robben Island. Robben Island was where the black political prisoners were beginning to be held for their very long sentences. So that was the view I had, not for long, because I couldn't hold on for that long.
Could you read the poem now?
In solitary confinement, Sea Point police cells. In the early morning, when the light and the sea smell come stumbling in, salt, sea, sun, and the green imagined breakers, I greet the shadows with the names of my brothers and sister, and watch them coil and yawn on morning's grey wall. I breed a new sense to learn the secrets known to the sea, how our drowning flesh dissolves until yellow the bones go rolling, rolling into generation of sand, shell, and sandstone, and leave only the rise and the fall of the seas, far Atlantic roll.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about the poem, and the first one will not be evident to people who've just listened to it and haven't seen it on the page. It's written in four-line verses, but each of the lines in the verses is indented so that they don't start in the same place. They don't start simply on the left-hand side of the page in the same place. And I wondered what it was that led you to adopt that form.
Honestly, I have no idea. I was trying to get the sensation of the sound of the distant sea, and that was the way that it seemed to have. I don't want to underestimate the experience. At that stage, in the third week, I was beginning to lose a sense of who I was. It was on one of those days when I was standing on that lavatory and I turned around and looked and saw myself lying on the bed in it was a mattress in the corner of the cell, and realized then that I was doing what happens to people in solitary confinement. They quite quickly lose their sense of identity. And I suppose, I mean, the poem is about the loss of personal identity.
It's also, I think, though, about what one of the lines says in it about breeding a new sense. It's a very striking line that comes at the halfway point in the poem when you say, I breed a new sense. And at that point, the poem moves out into a much larger space, the space of the ocean, as though you're escaping from solitary confinement in your imagination. Was that something that occurred to you as the poem was written?
It was the sense of no longer being confined within one's body, which is both exciting and also terrifying. That the imagination does that, can do that. The business of losing one's identity. It's documented. Almost everybody who's been through solitary confinement talks about that sensation. In some senses, it's marvelous. I mean, because the awful thing about being a writer is that bad experience is actually wonderful. In a sense, the more bad experiences you survive, the more likely you are to be an interesting writer.
Yeah, because I mean, in a way, what solitary confinement does here is it allows you to acquire a kind of visionary power in the poem, to reach out to some great elemental sense of the ocean and of time, which in a way releases you from imprisonment, it seems to me. I think it's also a poem that announces what I always think of as a condition of your imagination, and that is that you're endlessly putting together a here and an elsewhere, a place and something that lies beyond it. And I think this is a poem that shows that, and we may come back to that element in your poetry as we continue the conversation. But I'd like to move on a little bit now from that poem, because you moved to England in 1964, and you South Africa becomes for you not a physical location anymore, but a memory and a kind of haunting. And at the same time, in England, you marry, you become a father, you also embark upon a career as a writer. Yet it seems to me all the time the experience of South Africa, the memory of South Africa, the haunting that South Africa is in your mind and your imagination continues. And you write a number of poems about this, and I think in a moment I'd like to ask you to read one of them, which is called What Heist Said, which is a poem that's written in and about domestic circumstances, but is in an odd sense, I think, also about another kind of solitary confinement. But before you read it, I wonder if you could just say a little bit to us about why it's called What Heist Said.
We've been arguing, as you know, John, about the pronunciation. I actually consulted a friend of mine in the BBC. He said that haste is a perfectly acceptable. It's in my imagination, it's always been what Hay said. Anyway, heist or haste.
Yeah.
He's the central character in Conrad's, some people think Conrad's greatest novel, a late novel, that Conrad wanted to call Nothing, but the publishers insisted on a different title, so he called it Victory. And Victory and Nothing in Conrad's imagination were very close. The novel ends when Heist Haste is on an island which has been invaded by wickedness, and his beloved girlfriend is in a house which has been set on fire, and he takes the decision to walk back into that fire. And as he goes, he admits he admits to himself and to the reader what it is that he's doing. The poem I wrote was written after the birth of a son, and after the check came for my the first advance on my first novel, and we were very, very broke, my wife and I, terribly broke. But we used it to have a holiday in Cornwall. It was a strange hotel in Tadgel, and if it survives, I would be surprised. It was almost empty in August, but we went there and had a memorable holiday. And I think then, thanks to the wife I'm still married to, beginning to learn how to love someone, and certainly how to love my children, or yes, my son in this particular case. Shall I read the poem?
Yes, please.
I have come, the darkness says, to which the sea replies in whispers that will hardly reach the burning house upon the island. Remember me and be afraid. This dark delights me. It staggers like a child, uncertain of the ground below him, and then speaks, child pretending, I will not sleep again. No, not ever. The sea has no need to threaten that. I'm not afraid, says my son, half asleep, but will not let me go. The house is drifting out to sleep, as if the island too were drifting out to sea, massed and steady and alive again, moving with the air against the swing of earth. To make myself feel safe, I say aloud, my son is sleeping now. My wife is reading in her bed, and I am writing this. Breathing slow, I trust myself upon the air. Welcome, says the sea. Men in clean white robes are gathered on the headland, waving branches. Rule my kingdom, drowning sailor, says the sea. Oh, save me, calls the sailor, for I shall sleep too cold on these cold shores. The men are gathered now upon the shore. the rocks are speaking, blood is gathered up like crags of seaweed. Light is gathered on the waves. My son has woken, afraid, he cries, afraid. Afraid, I comfort him. How strange my sleep must seem to those who teach me love. How slow the learning not to be afraid. And yet the sea returns and love is taken up into the air. Not dark, my son, that you must fear, but too much light. As policemen choose the brightest, cleanest rooms to ask their questions in, so worse diseases grow than we have dreamt of underneath a microscope. And yet I say, I search for light. And so the sea remembers me, gravely makes my home. Unknown foreign sailor, note the watchers on the headland, begin a prayer. Witness this, my son, my wife, my sleeping son. That man is lost who learns too late to love. Remember me asleep and walking in my private, loveless light.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question which again takes up on the theme of here and elsewhere. This is not a poem that is obviously about South Africa. It seems to be a poem about domestic life and a kind of moment of fear or terror that invades domestic life. And yet there is a hint of South Africa in the line about the policeman and the interrogation room. I wonder how much the fear in the poem derives from your experience of solitary confinement, or whether that fear is an altogether more metaphysical fear, something that is without obvious cause, or
I think it's probably both, but I went on having nightmares about policemen walking into my room for years and years and years. I mean, when we were first married, I would often wake in a complete panic of terror. At least once I managed to get my elbow around my wife's throat, and I was in the process of strangling. She's rather smaller than I am. I was in the process of strangling her when fortunately she managed somehow to wake me up. But no, the terror went on, an actual terror of intrusion. In my old age, it seems to have gone now. But I still, oddly enough, at night, prefer to have the door of my bedroom slightly ajar rather than completely closed. I do not like being shut in. I still find it's obviously a psychological wound that I shall never be healed of.
And it also makes you into something, an almost spectral presence in your own domestic existence. As though, I mean, at the end of the poem, there's a feeling almost that you're anticipating your own death, as though you've become posthumous in some strange kind of way.
Well, fortunately, that hasn't happened. I haven't quite got to the posthumous stage, yes. But yeah, the fear of death. There's another poem that we're not reading this time that I wrote for my 26th birthday. And it ends up by saying that what solitary taught me was to be afraid of death in a way that I hadn't been afraid of before. So solitary, that short spell of solitary confinement remains an absolute defining experience in my life.
Yeah. I'd like to move on chronologically again in your life a few more years. You are exiled in England, effectively, and your South African citizenship is for a while suspended, I think. So you become, well, you
terminated entirely, I think. I mean, I become a British citizen after 5 years. I'm fortunate enough to be registered under the British South Africa Act. And so I'm actually a registered Brit. Thank goodness.
Right. And you go back to South Africa first in 1996.
What happens is as soon as I became British, the South Africans put me on a list of the select list of Brits who required visas before being admitted to South Africa. When I applied for a visa to go back, it was refused. And this went, I mean, I forget how many times I applied for a visa. Finally, in 1991, I think it was, I wrote to the South African ambassador in London, who happened to be somebody I'd known since a boy, and said to him, I would rather not write to the Times to say that this public school headmaster has been refused a visa to enter South Africa. And I got a letter then saying, your visa restrictions have been removed, or words to that effect. And from then on, I've been allowed to go back whenever I want, because apartheid by then had ended. I'm not sure I would have actually wanted to go back to South Africa before the end of apartheid, except I did once go in without permission in 1986, because my little brother was dying of cancer, and he wanted me to go back. So I went back and was held at the airport and eventually allowed in for 24 hours on compassionate grounds.
And when you went back in 1992, is that the year that you first went back?
Yes.
Spain? Yeah. You were encountering a country that had, so to speak, existed in your imagination and again in your memory. What was it like actually going back there and witnessing it again in the flesh, in its physical reality?
Well, in 92, we were still full of hope. Apartheid had gone. Mandela was the president. The election had been everything looked as though it was going to work out really well. A few of us knew that actually it was likely to take a bit longer than the most hopeful people thought. But it was wonderful to be back, physically wonderful to be back, and to see old friends and to go to places I had in my mind's eye for a long time.
And one of those places was the school, I think, that your father had taught at. Is that right?
My father had been headmaster of Uplands School in what was then the Eastern Transvaal in White River. And I went back to, he died very shortly after leaving that job. The job effectively killed him. A combination of the job and overwork and smoking and a bad heart killed him.
And this leads you to write in a form that you've come back to quite often, I think, which is to write an elegy on your father on the occasion of your revisiting that school.
That's right. Using the form that Tennyson uses in memoriam. And in fact, in the poem that I'm going to read, there is actually a specific reference. There are two literary references that I can think of. One is to Tennyson in memoriam, and the other is to John Donne about the Day of Judgment. The poem is just called Uplands School, White River, Elegy. I should say that I was traveling with my wife and daughter and a very close South African friend who had set up the whole trip for us. I found the road and then the turning right, just past the second dam and up the hill. The floating trees were there still, the valley dropping down from sight, the red earth drive to the big house set in solid white against the sky. the school my father left to die 10 days later in a strange place. I stopped the car to hold the moment thus, to see the things that had or hadn't changed, the lawns and garden rearranged, the classrooms added to the house, the way the trees had grown shrinking distance. Once, this was my home, and it isn't now. I turned to show my daughter how the shape of things has altered since. It made me catch my breath to see the known unchanged, and yet I hardly knew a face. Strange to be a stranger in a place which once had seemed so much my own. A grave-eyed child is brought to say hello. I have to ask again the name I thought I heard, and heard all right. I taught her father 30 years ago, when mine was ill, and too briefly I returned. I should have stayed. Instead, I went away to where I thought my duty lay. You died then, when my back was turned. I knew quite well I wouldn't see you here, but nonetheless, I guess I hoped to learn, miraculous on my return, that we had somehow skipped the years. And when I'd seen the hall they had built to mark your name and years of service here, I took myself away alone to look at where I knew you'd be at work if you were here at all. For sure, it's you I came to see and really nothing else. In that dark house, no shadow falls across the threshold. That's not you, ghostly at the desk. That's me. That damned pipe and those long nights of sharpened pencils soon and sooner took you off too young. And almost all that's left is hope that we might meet on the last busy day, if such a day there is. And I despair as I stare out of doors to where I hear the latest children play. There is no God, there is no life to come, there is no time when we shall meet again. We have to learn to live with pain, impermanence in our long home. And as I stood in blank-eyed misery there, reflecting on my father who was dead, my daughter took my arm and said, I thought that I might find you here. You've come to look for him, I know. I told the others where you'd be. It's just like you. I wish that I could meet him too. I want a father when I'm old.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question about that form, the quatrain form, and the role that rhyme plays in the poem? It's a poem of very strong feeling, it seems to me, a poem about grieving for the death of your father, and it's a poem about some defeated expectation, the hope that you might somehow, see him again, and the loss of that hope. Do you think that writing in rhyme helps to sustain a poem through these strong encounters with particular feelings?
In part, it's rhyme is a control mechanism. I mean, it helps tie the emotion in. But also searching for rhyme when one is working on a poem, searching for rhyme obviously often sets one off in slightly different directions. So it can be, I don't want to use the word encouraging in that sense. It sends one off in unusual directions. I mean, I think of that poem. I know it's called Elegy, and of course it's about my father. But it's as much as anything. It's about my daughter and the love that there exists between a father and a daughter. I mean, if you want to see me weep, show me any film or play or read to me anything where a child is reunited with a parent. That seems to me to be somehow absolutely crucial to being human.
Yes, and in this poem, your daughter, or a daughter, comes in at the end of it, and she's like an angel, it seems to me. She performs the function of an angel. She provides you with a way out of a situation which seems to you, at least at that moment in the poem, is one of what you call blank-eyed misery. And then the daughter comes into the poem, and suddenly there's a release from that misery into another kind of emotion.
Well, I have two sons, but only one daughter. Mm-hmm. I love all three of them. The daughter is my literary executor, and she's very special. I'm not sure she'd want anybody to call her an angel. She's rather a strong-minded angel, shall we say?
Yeah, I was thinking about what happens when you take somebody who's in your family and put them into a poem. They begin to take on another kind of poetic existence, which is quite independent of their real biographical existence. I mean, you've placed her artistically in that poem at its ending, and in the process of doing that, as it were, she becomes something more than literally your daughter. She becomes a special kind of presence in the poem itself, it seems to me.
I have known at least one of my sons shake a finger at me and say to me, "Dad, you're not to put me in that poem."
Why do you think he says that?
I don't know. I think it's a kind of embarrassment at fatherly affection, probably.
Right. Can we stay with revisiting South Africa for a bit longer? Because it's, in your writing about it, it's obviously about revisiting places that you've known, and revisiting people that you've known, some of whom, as in the case of your father, are dead, some of whom are still alive. But it's also an encounter with something that I think is very important to you, and that is the landscape of South Africa itself, its vastness. And I wonder if you could read from a poem which, in a sense, is about this vastness, about this landscape and what happens in it. It's a poem called Vergelegen.
Forgive me for correcting your pronunciation, Professor Cook. Vergelegen, which means lying far away. It's actually it's quite a common name for some bits of South Africa. And this was a farm that was actually farmed by the man who has been my closest friend since he was vice president of the National Union of Students when I was president, and then he became the president, and we're as, in some ways, closer than brothers. We're utterly different and very, very, very close. Meder Osler, he's called. So Vergelegen. A painter's eye might catch this light, retreating shades of purple, blue, and grey, though grass which wind has stripped and whipped away is brush-stroked, almost white. The ostrich pace the boundary fence. The mountains that we see so far away lie closer than our feeble senses say, their distance mere pretense. The call of cranes on close patrol comes rolling, rolling from the far-off plain, and downward stoop the falcons to maintain horizons in control. Korans crank upward into flight, then croak portentous warnings, storms of rain. The clapper larks go flapping up again, then whistle down from sight. Now in your fingers bruise a spray of pungent half-dead leaves. Scent stains the air and won't let go. Delight is always there. It dances night and day. Yet no one calls this place his own. The fragile spirits of the dead peer out from where they shelter on the level height to strike a sounding stone. Their past disclaims both time and place. Though knowledge gained by loss is hard to bear, you've found just how it is to look despair, unflinching in the face. This jade clear light brings skies so near, the stars and planets gathered in a crowd. You'd think that if you were to call out loud, they'd hear your voice up there. Too late to pray? You smile and say we have to learn to cope with no more hope, not even hope of hope. It lies too far away.
The poem has a number of different sort of occupants of the landscape. I mean, we start with the birds, the ostrich, the cranes, and the corhants, and then move on to other kinds of inhabitants of this landscape, the fragile spirits that you describe towards in a later stanza of the poem. There's a striking line which I wanted to ask you about, which is this one. There are these people these creatures, these presences that dwell in this place, and yet no one calls this place his own, is the line that resonates for me in this poem. And I wondered how much you're attracted to the idea of places that, so to speak, are nobody's property, which nobody possesses, but which you can yourself find a kind of dwelling in.
I hadn't thought. I think you're absolutely right, and one of the extraordinary things about being in the Great Karoo is the sense one does have of time that goes back a very, very long way. And one of the places that my friend Medrosa always takes visitors to is a level area quite high up on a koppie, on a hill, where there are sounding stones, resonating stones, where it's almost certain the original inhabitants danced and danced and prayed. It was a religious gathering place, and around the edge of that gathering place, there are very, very old rock engravings of a variety of animals, particularly of buck, of eland. And when one is there, and of course the descendants of the Khoisan original inhabitants, in a sense, are still there, because the Karaki people, the people who are the closest to being the inhabitants of the area, not the settlers like the farmers, English or Afrikaans or Dutch farmers there. That you still see the Karaki people in the area, but one does get that sense of time going backwards a very long way. Partly because you still find relics there of the fact that the whole area was once covered by sea. You actually find seashells in this inland part of South Africa. Is that?
Yes, well, there's a way of thinking about the line politically, of course, and in a sense you've just alluded to it, because you're writing about a space that's been occupied by successive colonial invasions, and yet you're also in the poem imagining it as a place that is, so to speak, beyond anybody's particular property or possession, that it has an existence that is independent of its colonial history and of the legacies of that colonial history. And it seems to me that that's connected very strongly to the possibility that there is something like religious presence in this place. That it's a place where the human and the divine might come into some connection. But the poem is also very interestingly about the disappointment of that expectation, of that hope about a connection between the human and the divine, which you begin to summon towards the end of the poem, and then it's in a sense held backward, held away, partly through the counsel, I take it, of your friend, the you, that the poem addresses at this point.
I'd take a long time to answer that question fully, but there are pockets of hope, and one of the pockets of hope is a place that the Oslers set up called the Hantam Community Education Project, which is a community, it's a school and a community health project, and it is doing the most extraordinary ameliorative work in that particular, with the poorest of the poor. It is an extraordinary, but unfortunately, there are not many places in South Africa where one can actually find that kind of hope. More commonly, you have a feeling that you're in a place run by kleptomaniacs. I mean, just people just out to grab whatever they possibly can to make themselves and their clans rich, and to hell with everybody else. I mean, South Africa at the moment is not a very encouraging democracy.
Could we come back now to England, which is, after all, where you've spent most of your life, and to the question of, I suppose, a question that your poems return to from time to time, as to whether you're English or whether you're South African or whether you're neither of these things or both of these things at one and the same time. And there's another poem, I think, that's very striking about this one, that's also very strongly imbued with a sense of friendship, as is the poem that you've just read. The presence of a friend is quite important to the poem that you've just read, and I think is important to the poem that I'd like you to read now, which is called In England Now.
It arose from a question asked by a great friend of mine, Kate Wilson, at a poetry reading in London. I think actually where you were in the chair, John Cook, as far as I remember. And its epitaph is from Nigel Borshen, Darkness Falls from the Air. He says that, I don't think you belong to any country in particular when you're old. Kate Wilson at this function said to me, golly, Jonty, you've lived in England almost all your life. You've got an English voice, an English wife, English children. Isn't it time you simply accepted the fact that you're English now? And so this is my reply. In England Now. Before the dawn, a dream of what I lost by leaving when I did. And then the sky, blood-streaked enough for home, and I remembered what you asked. But haven't you already made your choice? You've lived in England more than half your life. You have a house, career, a wife, even an English voice. Old friend, you know quite well how much I've changed. But still I need those deep horizons where, with no impediment but air, the far-flung land is ranged. You say I'm almost English now. Should keep myself concealed? A fractured part of me, my heart perhaps, will always be in Africa. When I'm asleep, or when the early breezes shift the haze of mornings into Sussex summer skies, the promises of heat revive those distant, dusty days. So if we immigrants from overseas have found in England rich security, since here one may be almost free, such teeming destinies once held in England's boundless masterwork come now to sweep the streets or teach or nurse? Must we be told that we should curse our past? Curse our past as wholly dark, accumulated anguish for a name, and nothing good to find but grief in loads, piled up like cans on mountain roads to fool an exile home. And yet both here and there I'm tainted by the past. An Englishman come lately back again who thought that he might skip the pain, colonial to the last. So here I stay, half hoping still to go. The claim of birth would be of little use if once again I made a choice. The years are not so slow. The morning spreads its wings. The ash tree leaves are making music out of light and shade. The early colors smudge and fade. A roosting ringdove grieves. I am in England now, old hypocrite who bows and smiles and nods and does his best to seem content. I'm loyal, at least. Or is this still deceit?
I'd like to ask you a question about the last verse of that poem. Are you the old hypocrite?
Yeah, of course.
It's not England. England's not.
No. I'm the old hypocrite, I'm afraid. The public school headmaster with a revolutionary past, very comfortably set in my cottage in East Sussex at my considerable pension and my lovely wife and happy family. Yes, and an old hypocrite. What have I got to be unhappy about?
But the poem's also about resisting that description of yourself, isn't it? Or
I hope there's a certain ironic sense that I hope one won't be taken too literally.
who are you being loyal to? I'm loyal at least, because I mean this bears upon the question of it.
I think I'm loyal to an idea of England. I think I'm in some ways I am passionately English, I think. And I think some of the things that England stands for are magnificent and should be celebrated.
And could you say what they are?
I suppose compassion is an important part of it. When the chips are down again and again, I mean, I think it's extraordinary how the English, or the British, if you want to say, become again one nation. The class divides, which are in some ways so very strong, seem to disappear when we're under pressure. I think there's a huge amount to be admired in this country, even when I'm crossest with it.
We need to come to an end soon, Jonty. So I'd like to finish our session with a reading of a very different kind of poem. It's a poem that will return us to one of the things that we've been talking about, and that is the importance to you of the love that you have for and the love that you've received from your family. But this is a poem that is about your wife, I think, and it's called Love Song in Old Age.
It's part of a sequence called Requiem, which I wrote on a long leave back in South Africa, addressed to the person I've been married to I was lucky enough to meet at a party in London in 1967, fell in love with that same evening, and have been in love with on and off. it's been a marriage for 52 years. Love song in old age. I walked outside and saw with surprise, as if I had new eyes, you in your chair reading, stretched out sleekly in the sunshine, young again. And you looked up in the hard-edged sun and said, "You look so young standing there watching me." I was dozing in the sunshine like a seal. To the old you, I said, "Oh, my dear, I see now that you wear your years like finery." And you replied, smiling, that time beguiles us. And then the sun shifted sideways slightly, and you laughed lightly, you in your chair reading, and I watching, and we were both ourselves again.
Thank you, Jonty. I don't think I want to discuss that poem with you because it doesn't need discussion. But it's been very good to talk to you, and thank you for reading the poems. And now I think we need to bring the session to an end.